Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Laura Maristany. I'm the founder and CEO of Katch Skills, and I'm excited to host and moderate today's conversation. I'll open it up a little bit and pass it to my fellow panelists to talk a little bit about themselves, and then we'll start to dig into our topic of the day around how do we enable a skills-first economy. So I have several hats. Been in DC over 20 years, working across sectors, policy, all the way to tech startups. And 2 years ago, launched my answer to some of these issues, which is Katch. Really looking at how we need to figure out a way to value all of the ways in which people learn. And I mean all the ways, from watching a video, reading a book, listening to a podcast. And to me, having worked in communities across the country, having seen all of the different investments, all of the work that is happening at the local level, which we will talk about today, to upskill communities, to look at non-traditional pathways to train folks into the jobs of the present and the future, that a lot of that hangs on the balance if we can't figure out a way to value it. We trust degrees a lot. In recent years, we've seen a huge percent, over 73% of businesses claiming that they're not looking at degree requirements in their hiring decisions. And we still have a long ways to go to actually make that the norm. And so that's a big part of what we're trying to do at Katch, actually having a tool to help us engage with that and to put it in the hands of all of us. And so I'm excited to have our panelists today, all of them from different angles, working on different initiatives to try to enable skills-first economies. So I'll pass it to John, and if you would be so kind and introduce yourselves.
All right, thanks for that great intro. My name is John Hartley. I'm a senior fellow here at FREOPP. I focus on higher education, as well as a lot of other topics in sort of macroeconomics, finance, and sort of labor topics like this panel is all about. I also run a podcast at the Hoover Institution called the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century Podcast. And I interview a lot of policymakers, economists, and talk about their careers and main contributions, ideas, policy, markets, and so forth.
Akash, Chougule. I am Vice President of Government Affairs at Americans for Prosperity, which is the nation's largest fiscal conservative limited government grassroots advocacy organization. I spent a fair bit of time on the Hill doing a lot of grassroots events and kind of more right-of-center media and audiences and things like that, in which this is becoming a more salient issue. And then I also am an honorary senior fellow at the Institute for the American Worker, which is a conservative labor policy organization.
And Steve Taylor, I'm a director and senior fellow for Future of Work at Stand Together Trust and lead our partner and coalition strategy around Future of Work, which means elevating non-degree pathways, really working on the supply and demand side signals for non-college credentials and hiring. But I balance this focus on non-degree pathways with another role that I hold, which is a member of the council, State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. So I have to balance this delicate championing higher education and sort of the public good there with this need for non-degree alternative pathways. And I think there's room for both.
Awesome, thank you. So let's go right in. I think a lot of folks see labor as this separate thing, this separate thread, important to the economy, but not necessarily intertwined. How about we start with John and we talk a little bit about what role does skills first as a solution play in prosperous economic development?
Sure. So one, I mean, skills, hugely important. Education, human capital, hugely important. Economic growth. In general, it's interesting. People are very focused on recessions and which are very important, but the importance and the differences surrounding economic growth, particularly between countries, is just on a whole other level of magnitude. So you think about like even the Great Recession was like a 5% divot in the GDP growth trend of the U.S. Whereas you look at other countries, countries that may not have the same levels of education or the same sort of institutions, whether it's property rights and so forth. You look at a country like China, it's got GDP per capita that's like 1/7 that of the U.S. And I think a lot of those cross-country income differences reflect things like education, skills, and I think so on a sort of a magnitude standpoint, skills growth, education, so important, super important. Can't be overstated. There's this famous quote by a famous economist, Nobel Prize-winning economist named Robert Lucas of the University of Chicago. He said, once you start thinking about growth, you can't think about anything else. Very important. Growth is so important, even though it may not be sort of the most headline news thing. I think there's 3 things that we can do that I'll propose to you that I think meaningfully can shift the growth trajectory of the U.S. and are all related to labor policy in some way. First would be a higher education kind of thing. Stop subsidizing negative ROI degrees. I think one, it puts taxpayers in a bad place. It saddles people with a lot of student debt, and it's just sort of not really working the way things should be in terms of incentives on the part of colleges, and we need to have proper incentives on the part of colleges to be giving kids degrees that are actually going to help them have rewarding careers. That's number one. Number 2, occupational licensing deregulation. The number of licenses in the U.S. has skyrocketed in the past 50 years from what was like somewhere between 5 to 10% to now like 25 to 33% or something like that. Now you have to get a license if you want to be a hair braider, if you want to be a dog walker, and so forth. And doctors and so forth, very complicated, life-saving sorts of life-critical sorts of jobs should still have licenses. It's not saying that we should have no licenses, but we need, I think, to really rethink licensing quite a bit. Reciprocity, I think, is a huge thing that's starting to pass across states, starting with Arizona. What reciprocity means is that if you are a nail tech in Maryland, whether or not you can simply go and be a nail tech in Virginia. Believe it or not, that's not something that you can do without having to do a new exam and new training. It's a huge inefficiency. The third thing would be, I'd say, related to AI. That would be taking a wait-and-see approach to AI regulation. I think there's a lot of people that have watched, maybe the Terminator movies many times. Maybe I have, but I think one, a new technology, whether it's LLMs or some sort of any sort of new technology is least dangerous when it's first developed. And so I think just keeping that in mind when we talk about AI, some of the potential dangers. I think just seeing what it can do, how quickly it can help us assist with certain tasks. I think we're only at the beginning of that, and I think just sort of letting it run and sort of allowing this process of discovery, I think, is really important, at least early on. And things, if there are dangerous things that crop up, responding to that quickly. But I think taking a wait and see approach is I think the right approach to AI.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is I think a huge piece of this is cultural, which is that we can change all the laws that we want, but if people intrinsically in their minds are still going to value a fancy degree from a college over whether it's some kind of professional certification or life experience, that's a very difficult hurdle to get over. And so, I think really quickly on some of the points that John made on the higher education side, this is something that Republicans on the right have struggled for a long time to kind of have a cohesive solution around. And there finally is one. There's a bill called the College Cost Reduction Act, sponsored by Virginia Fox, who chairs the Education and Workforce Committee, a committee I used to work for, that would do many of these things, right? It would create accountability for colleges and for borrowers. And I think in general, we're gonna chip away very gradually. And this bill is one example, right? At chipping away at exactly the problem John is talking about, where the underlying assumption is that if you have a fancy piece of paper, you're immediately qualified to do any number of jobs. And reforms like that, I think, get towards that. The second would be on the workforce development side, and Steve will probably get into more detail here, but the government spends so much money, but as in any other issue, even cutting a single penny from anything is so easily demonized by the mainstream media, by progressives, what have you, that I think the first thing we can do is redirect existing dollars in a much better way. Of course, the private sector should have a much larger role, and government should frankly have a much smaller role. But before we even get to that conversation, we're spending hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars. And right now, a huge portion of that just goes to these state agencies and these state boards, and it just kind of sits there and kind of does God knows what. And so when they reform WIOA, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, simply making recipients of these dollars much more accountable to the actual outcomes of their workforce development programs, I think is a very simple fix that the federal government could do. And again, the House already passed their version of this reform. I believe it had something like 380 votes in the House or something, hugely bipartisan vote, which again, didn't go as far as probably any of us wanted to, but beginning to have more accountability around the current dollars to actually be improving people's outcomes and livelihoods is, I think, a very low-hanging fruit thing. And then just to circle back on the first point, the cultural piece, I mentioned Dr. Fox. She has a great sort of rhetorical point that she makes, which is that she refuses to use the word training. We used to refer to it on the committee as the T word because she had a professor who used to say that we train dogs, but we educate people, right? It's a very sort of tongue-in-cheek way to think about things. But again, I think this, especially from the professional class, which I would argue all of us in this room are part of that, it isn't just about the hiring practices, but it really is the manner in which we're thinking about sort of our fellow Americans and the value that they create in society and who's high class and low class and all of that. And it's a longer conversation, but I think especially given kind of the populist moment that we're in politically and culturally, there's no better time like the president to really start taking that to heart as you know, kind of generally right of center people to shift how people think about this space.
Yeah, I often joke that when we talk about the workforce system, workforce boards, higher education to some extent, the only people that these programs, that these institutions leave gainfully employed are the folks working at the local workforce board, or in many cases, faculty themselves. So we definitely need to do more around the value and the relevance. I think there are a few things that have sort of led us to really this skills first moment. One is the Great Recession. So millions of Americans after the Great Recession turned to higher education when the labor market was scarce, jobs were scarce, unemployment was high. They looked to higher education, they went back, they got graduate degrees because they were able to access student loans or other grant programs at a time when they couldn't find a job. Then we had the pandemic. Going into the pandemic, higher education was not the solution, especially for many of these students who had already borrowed to get a master's degree that still hadn't paid off. So at the same time the pandemic hit, we now butt up against this growing skepticism among the American public of the value and relevance of a college education. So they hold high debt, a credential with little value in the labor market. They were hesitant to go back to higher education, which had essentially failed them for the past decade. And so now there's openness among most Americans. A majority of Americans are now open to some alternative or some non-degree credential. Now a tight labor market has also led employers to say, we don't have 2, 3, 4, 6 years to wait for somebody to get a degree to fill the gap in the labor market. So there's openness among employers to hire based on skills and alternative credentials. And I hate that I'm using the word alternative. It's something I need a rubber band to slap my own wrist. We like to say non-degree because alternative makes it sound like it's less than a degree. So there's that. And then we also have states leading the way. So we know that in the skills first movement, degrees seem to be the safe proxy for employers to look at quality and assess quality of candidates. And when you start to look at alternative assessments, there is some legal, regulatory, and policy risk in doing so. So our effort at Stand Together Trust, working with AFP and partners like Cicero Institute, has really been to scale up the number of states who have implemented skills-based hiring, because that sets a really important precedent for the private sector to follow suit. Part of this is states, we now have about 20 of them that have done this, can absorb some of that early policy, regulatory, legal risk with essentially experimenting with new alternative hiring assessments. And again, we want to see the private sector follow very closely behind as some of this risk is absorbed in the public sector.
Yeah, one of the, just kind of summarizing a little bit and bringing it to some of the work I've done in community and with technology companies, there's, there's, I think, 3 areas, and I'd be curious to hear a little bit about each of those 3. So one, how do we understand the skills that we need in an economy? where I think we need to dig a little bit more into the role that workforce investment boards have or have not played to date, the skills that we have already in our economies, and how, and finally, like, how do we get the ones that we're missing, right? So what kinds of strategies have you seen in each of those three buckets, is where I'd like to kind of dig a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, one I would just point out immediately that comes to mind is making sure these programs are not only taking into account, but primarily taking into account the needs that employers in their communities actually have. If we have workforce development programs and state boards and all this stuff that are just sort of, it's a bunch of bureaucrats and academics sitting in a room deciding what they think a skills program should look like, how we have no indication of whether or not that's actually serving a need, let alone the need specific to their community. But if you're in an area where there is a specific need for a specific skill set because a specific industry is very, very prevalent, that's something that workforce board or education system should be responsive to. And I don't think that right now really is a status quo in most state boards. And so one that is, I think, frankly, built around the needs of local employers should be an immediate first step.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about what it takes for higher education to create an offer or even change a program, it's such an intense process. I mean, sitting on a board that we are required to approve every new program or program change at a public institution, we're revisiting that process because it is so labor intensive. And then if you think about any other accredited programs, they're not able to keep pace with the labor market. So when we think about these alternatives or these non-degree pathways, they almost have to be offered by non-accredited institutions or non-accredited providers that have the nimbleness to work with employers and essentially change their curriculum on a dime. I mean, we're talking a matter of days or weeks. And so at Stand Together, across our various business units, we support organizations like Perscolas and Merit America. Now, these are tech training providers that essentially partner so deeply with employers that these students who are completing these trainings, and these are short-term trainings, they essentially, and here I'm using the T word, Dr. Fox is not in the room, essentially they have almost guaranteed employment when they complete. And we've got story after story where some of these students who had been failed by the traditional college system, where they got the degree, they did everything right, they enter the job market, they can't get a job, or they're severely underemployed, they end up at Perscolas or Merit America, they end up within 2-3 years making well over 6 figures with no debt. And so these types of pathways are what we've got to elevate. We've got to make sure that policymakers understand them, understand the policy barriers that are in place that prevent these types of programs from competing in a fair, open marketplace with higher education. Because until we do that, until we remove the subsidies and the protectionist policies like accreditation, it's going to be very hard for these other non-accredited providers or non-degree providers to truly compete. And so I think that, John, you talked about that fair sort of open marketplace competition subsidies. I'd love for you to kind of build on that.
Yeah, well, I guess we're talking a little bit about jobs training programs. There's, I don't know if people are familiar with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and this bill was passed in the 90s, and it sort of subsumes a lot of the old workforce training programs, many of that were developed during the war on poverty, sort of the LBJ era. I think things like Job Corps and stuff like that. There's not a lot of evidence that those programs work particularly well. So I think certainly some rethinking there in terms of what role government has in terms of these programs. I mean, a lot of money goes to Pell Grants, and it's not even clear what even is actually jobs training and so forth. This is a point that was made earlier here. But I think in terms of the original question about like what skills are going to be useful in the future, I think it's not easy to tell. Like I don't think there's like a simple, easy answer to that in the sense that the skills that were very valuable in the past aren't necessarily going to be the ones that are useful in the future. So to plug a FREOPP thing, one thing we do have, I will say, is we do have this FREOPP ROI calculator where you can go to basically any degree program at any school, and it's hooked up to the college scorecard, which is essentially a Department of Education project, partnership with the IRS, and they get all that. They match the IRS tax return income data to basically people's college records, and so they can look at what the track record of various degrees are. And as it turns out, I think 40% of master's degrees have negative ROI, roughly 20% or so of bachelor's degrees. So I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of master's degrees that aren't panning out. But I will say, like, I do think maybe the wisdom 5-10 years ago would have been, everyone should go and learn how to code. And then all of a sudden, like just about 2 years ago, we had this thing called LLMs that drops and things like Copilot that come out. And so, and that's been created huge productivity gains for people that are coding, as well as people that, obviously are doing writing related skill type work or things like, visual related things like in marketing and so forth. So, and obviously there's disruption in those places. Some people are having their tasks automated away. Other people are having their tasks transformed in a more sort of a complementary way. But I think learning how to use those sorts of tools, large language models, and how if your goal was coding before, how to use large language models to help you code better, or how to use them to, I don't know, do visual tasks better. I think thinking that way, I think is what I'd imagine be one thing to do in the future. But there's no kind of like one simple solution where, like, if you said everybody should code, then the sort of the wage premium on coding suddenly drops a lot, right? So you can't sort of there was sort of a supply and demand for tasks, and one that kind of evolves over time, and that's just, I guess, sort of the nature of how labor markets work.
So so just before the pandemic, I wrote this paper, talked about these 2 skills that were, sort of evergreen. It was following the 21st century evergreen skills, whatever you wanted to call them. And I posited that there are really 2 skills that we need everybody to have to navigate this sort of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous society, economy. And that's the idea that we need adaptable learners. So learner adaptivity. We need somebody to be able to navigate uncertain situations, complex situations, and know how to adapt and overcome. And then the other was this idea of job crafting behavior. We need people, and who knew that the pandemic was about to hit, right? We need people who can enter the labor market and say, you know what, I've got skills. There's not a perfect job that exists for me to deploy these skills, but we need them to be adaptable, identify needs in the economy and in the marketplace, be able, whether it's through gig work or contract work or more flexible work arrangements, show up in a way where they can add value and they create those opportunities for themselves. Because if people are sitting on the sidelines and they're just saying, what jobs are going to come to me, right? They're not going to be able to take advantage of the jobs in the new economy.
Yeah, I have been for the last 4 years helping to build some of those tech economies in underestimated regions, and there's sort of 2 dynamics that we see a lot. So one, when we're looking at the economic development strategy of a region, and usually the Workforce Investment Board will have some sort of big role as a part of that. But what tends to happen is that we look at what I call the big techie fish. So who's the aerospace engineering firm, the big tech company, the big healthcare company, the chip manufacturing facility. And we build the strategy around them. But then we forget that to make that a livable community, we actually need to have a tech stack, right? We need to have a livable community. So we need folks that are contributing to the local small businesses, that are working for all of the different layers of folks that contribute to making that economy prosperous. And so what tends to happen is, because the strategy is so focused on the big techie fish, then everybody else who is learning skills outside of those traditional pathways has a hard time getting those skills valued. But that same pathway is the one that is going to ultimately feed the big techie fish, right? So working with technology companies, platforms are a lot more specialized right now. Even if you go to college, if you're going to go work with a big tech company, you're going to have to learn their way. And you're going to have to get certified in an alternative way. And you're going to have to then figure out how you transfer that if you want to move jobs, if you want to go somewhere else, right? So there's this piece that is, how do you get the employers in a local economy, whatever size they are, from small businesses to the big techie fish, to understand that, to value it? And then how do you get individuals to be able to have access to some sort of transferability, some sort of portfolio, something different, because the current resume isn't working?
Yeah, I think that certainly I think speaks to what John's point is, that these are also constantly evolving, right? And so it's not even that the biggest fish in a current market is going to be the same one 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And I think it also gets back to the point Steve made, which is just the need to be adaptable, not only among individuals, but programs themselves, people designing them, and kind of what are the inputs that they're being influenced by. And so I think there's, John mentioned WIOA from the 90s. Like, anything in this space being static should be a huge red flag. If it doesn't immediately have built-in sort of reflection points, reconsideration points, inflection points, that the whole thing could be turned upside down and reworked, should be a major concern, especially, I think, in general, given just dynamic markets, but particularly given the moment that we're in. I think that's hugely important.
The other thing I'd say is, as we're focusing on the skills first movement, needs across various economies and regions in the country, the reality is, with declining birth rates, with just a slowing of our population growth, native population growth, we need to look at alternative strategies to fill many of these jobs. And so that means that we've really got to think about who, A, is sitting on the sidelines now of our workforce. And our colleagues at Georgia Center for Opportunity, I see one of them in the room, they're doing really great work to help those who are stuck in the morass of safety net programs and who are sitting on the sidelines. They have skills, but all of these incentives in the safety net system are stacked against them. They're preventing them from actually contributing those skills in the workforce. So we've got to address some of those misaligned incentives in our various safety net programs. The other is, we've got to have a really smart immigration strategy, legal immigration, and making sure that we've got opportunities for those who are in this country and have skills to really contribute to the labor market. And that goes back to a point, John, that you made around occupational licensing. How many times has somebody in this room been in an Uber and you start talking to your Uber driver and they're like, well, in my home country, I was a nurse or a doctor, or you name the profession. And here they're driving an Uber. They're severely underemployed. And so we've got to find ways to really think about how we change occupational licensing, whether it's universal recognition, and I am not our policy expert on these issue areas, but I do know that we have a skill shortage and we have people who are very willing and ready to contribute if we remove the barriers and allow them to. So that's got to be part of a strategy as well.
One of the places that comes to mind where this has downstream effects is within education itself. So your ability to be certified as a teacher, if you don't have teaching certification, but you have some kind of real life experience doing the thing you're supposed to be teaching to students, you're not sort of assumed to be certified to teach whatever subject that is, which one is just kind of insane from a education system standpoint, but then also gets to what are students being taught, right? Are they being taught ideas by someone who went to school and learned a certain thing, or are they being taught how to do the thing that they're going to be doing in the workforce by the person who already did it for 15 years? I think it sort of gets into the weeds of traditional K through 12 education policy itself when you're talking about high school level and things like that. But this point about occupational licensing has a lot of, I think, downstream, secondary, tertiary points to it.
I think I agree with all those points, and certainly, legal immigration is a huge issue, and I often wonder. I immigrated here from Canada, and I often wonder, would it have been faster if I just walked through the southern border, versus going through the whole legal system, start to finish. But I think what I will say, and I know sort of like I think a lot of this. One, there are some great movements. One, like I think reconsidering should college degrees be requirements for jobs. I think there's way too many job postings, or way too many jobs where college on the actual job posting, a college degree is listed as a requirement, where in fact it probably shouldn't be. I think that's a good movement, and I'm not a huge fan of a lot of tech firms out there, but I will give them credit. They were, I think, amongst the first to really just recognize that, well, if you know how to code, we don't really care whether you have a college degree or not. So I give them a lot of credit there. I will say this, and I know a lot of this is sort of all centered around what we could do better, I guess, from a policy standpoint or a labor sort of policy standpoint or an education policy standpoint. There's a lot that the U.S. is doing extremely well. And I think that can't be overemphasized enough. If you look at like GDP per capita of the U.S. versus like all the other advanced economies in the world, the U.S. is the only one that's actually still growing. Like since the global financial crisis, Western Europe and Canada has basically stopped growing. Japan stopped growing on a per capita basis even before that. But I think there's a major, major difference between the U.S. and the rest of the world, and that is technology and innovation. And it's not just, like how many big tech firms exist outside of the United States? Maybe Spotify in Sweden, Shopify in Canada. We had a brief blip of something called BlackBerry in Canada over a period of time. But also, it's not just what we consider tech; it's also pharma. It's a number of other things too, where it's just America totally blows the rest of the world away in terms of innovation. From an immigration standpoint, every person in the world, almost every founder in the world that sort of has some degree of success, a very, very high fraction of them immediately come to the U.S. as soon as possible. I think finding ways to allow those sorts of extremely talented innovators come to the U.S. I think is super important in the sense that those are the people that are going to be hiring our skilled workers of the future. So I think that the narrative I think is a super important one. And how do you continue to sort of nurture that innovation and technology story of the U.S. and how do you keep that going and not scare innovators away from the U.S. is I think a huge, very much related issue to this whole labor and education sort of policy discussion.
So I'm a fan of making sure we also get to very granular things that are working. So I appreciate that, John. I'd like you all, before we transition to questions, so the elephant is definitely coming back to the room. And that comes with opportunities also to kind of think through what that agenda is going to look like. So what would you say are the primary areas or agencies or issues that we should be focusing on as we're thinking about the opportunity in the skills first movement, in enabling skills first practices in the coming years?
Yeah, I think at a very high level, obviously the Department of Labor is where a lot of this stuff lives. There's an agency called ETA, the Employment Training Agency, I guess is the A, but administration. Thank you. We have these Susan Harwood grants for workforce development and all this stuff. But I think to John's point, it kind of touches every single part of our economy, right? That's the point at which it pulls in the Department of Commerce and Treasury and all these other things. And you have WIOA, and there'll be a tax bill next year that has some immigration provisions and all this stuff. So really every part of what our government does could be tied in here. And I think what your question makes me think of, Laura, is kind of the politics around it. And I mentioned that we're in this populist moment, and this has some very obviously populist appeal when we talk about non-college audiences, people who are detached from the workforce and things like that. And specifically, frankly, to get to the elephant in the room, I think a lot of the populations where President Trump has had the most appeal, specifically in growing the Republican coalition, right? Non-college men, frankly, right? That traditionally people sort of thought of non-college white men, right? Then it was non-college people of both genders, or now it's of all races. And it gets to this very, I think, salient political moment, but the challenge is making the connection. This stuff can get very weedy very quickly. And I think one of the sort of unfortunate but opportune pieces of our political moment is that policies are much more impactful, much more likely to catch fire when they are perceived as going after a political enemy, right? I think that's unfortunate, but it very much applies in this instance, right? Where the status quo is not only harming people who are the reason that President Trump is going back to the White House as far as people who are being failed by the system, but it's actually benefiting entrenched status quo special interests who are diametrically opposed to what really anyone in any segment of the right of center in this country stands for, whether it's labor unions or it's higher education or it's public sector bureaucrats, you name it, right? You have all these kind of special interests who are benefiting. And so I think the extent to which people in this room and elsewhere make the connection between the things that we want to achieve in this space from a policy standpoint and how it behooves the sort of broader conservative movement politically from a voting coalition standpoint would be a very, very sort of important piece of doing this. And it's something that I think is being done in other spaces, but has not yet come to this one. I hope that we can do that in the coming year, year and a half.
Yeah, so I think, funding drives incentives, drives behavior. So if we think about funding, higher education funding, really we call it a voucher, the Pell Grant. It's not really a voucher because those funds go to an institution who then distribute them to a student. So how we fund higher education really impacts the behavior of the choices that people make. So people who might otherwise want to pursue a non-degree pathway, unless they've got disposable income and access to private capital to pursue those pathways, they're limited. They're stuck to a higher education pathway because that's where they can use the subsidy. So we've got to shift where and how people can use those subsidies that exist currently. So that means moving more toward true voucher individualized funding. So if Johnny wants to go pursue a non-degree credential, they can use their Pell Grant and go to a non-degree provider. They don't have to go to a college. Same with the workforce system. Right now, those dollars go to local workforce boards. And I mentioned, the people who end up gainfully employed are those workforce board staff. So until we change the incentives there, whether it's through the WIOA reauthorization bill and better pay for performance contracts and outcomes, or actually giving those dollars to individual workers, learners, to go pursue the training that actually has the proven outcomes, we're going to see incentives drive behavior that we've seen for decades that has led us to really bad outcomes and led more and more workers to be underemployed on the sidelines and not realizing their full potential.
I would say if you're working in the details of the space, and I see a lot of people in this room that are already doing so, and you are not already thinking specifically about what can fit through the Senate's Byrd rule to fit into this tax reconciliation bill next year, you should be doing that because that, again, given the moment that we're in, Congress does very, very little that is substantive. One of the things they will do next year is pass a reconciliation bill that can pass with 51 votes through the Senate, but there are very specific guardrails about the provisions that are in there. They have to be budgetary in nature and blah, blah, blah. But again, given the role of government that we're talking about here, just sheer dollars and cents, there likely is quite a bit that can fit through those guardrails in the Senate. And it's something we should be thinking about very proactively because it is a very rare opportunity to make some significant progress.
Luckily, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, depending on where you sit, have given us ample potential pay-fors in the myriad programs passed over the past few years.
Awesome. So we have about 8 minutes to take a couple of questions. I don't know if anybody has. Let's wait for the mic so we can make sure.
Thank you for that discussion. I have a bunch of questions, but one, when we're talking about Department of Education and I suppose labor and IRS rating institutions, do any of you see any freedom problems with that potentially?
I mean, I'll let you go really quickly. My gut reaction is if they're receiving federal dollars from the taxpayer, they should be subject to some kind of oversight and accountability. And until we can reduce the prevalence of those federal dollars, then government does have a role in making sure that they're serving the public interest.
In identifying the parameters. So I think that's highly problematic from a freedom standpoint.
How so?
Well, it is, different colleges have different missions, and their missions may not align with the parameters or the box that they're put into by, say, Department of Education or IRS. So that's one problem. And the second problem is, I guess we're probably, most of us now are kind of sensitive to the idea of government acting as a predator on freedom. So,
yeah, one quick example I'd give is like Hillsdale College doesn't receive $1 of federal funds, and they're basically free to do whatever they want. I think part of the, and this is not really on the college, this is more on government and policymakers, but the dollars need to come with some level of clarity of expectation of what they are intended to do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that I see that from an accountability, but from the freedom perspective, it seemed highly problematic, which I guess is why Hillsdale did what it did.
Yeah, I think writ large, what we need to do is untether accreditation and federal funding. So right now, the Hillsdales, Grove City, there are several other colleges are not eligible for federal aid because they're not accredited by choice because accreditors would come impose restrictions and requirements on their model, their curriculum. And so one of the things that if you're looking for a tangible thing to do is work toward untethering accreditation from federal funding.
So it just seems, it smacks of bigger government, not less government.
I think the untethering, accreditation is a step toward
I think I
removing
agree with that.
yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to go the opposite direction. So you've talked a lot about the kind of role of secondary higher education. Is there a bigger role that K through 12 should be playing in thinking about how we better prepare students to not go to college or to actually move forward with some other skill?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know that I would have a detailed answer here. My gut reaction certainly is yes. I think that piece about how we accredit or certify K through 12 teachers, it seems like a pretty simple one that just if you didn't go to some school of education doesn't mean you're not qualified to teach students a skill if you have the skill. But yeah, I think a lot of the stigma I think comes from college, from high schools, right? They hang the banners of everyone's going to college and all this stuff. I think that's a big piece of it that comes to mind. But yeah, certainly I think it's should start from a very young age.
I've seen a lot of really good examples. So obviously, giving parents the options to put their kids in schools that are teaching in alternative ways and that are having those conversations in different ways is going to be super important. Some of the things that we've seen, going back to the core, having advisors at schools that actually understand the future of work, the present and the future, because a lot of those guidance counselors and teachers don't really understand what the jobs of the present and the future are. So they're guiding kids into careers that are obsolete. So it's not only the pathway, it also has to do with vocational training, apprenticeship, even if they're being funneled into alternative pathways. But we've seen some good programs that are trying to do that from that angle. And I think obviously beyond choice and all of those things, making sure that that we're also kind of looking outside. So when we're talking about non-traditional pathways, we tend to focus a lot on K-12, right? Like the future that is coming. We also need to be looking at transitioning careers. So you also have a lot of students that think about, the example I like to use is think about a computer engineer, went to do a bachelor's degree and graduated this year and missed out on learning all of the AI pieces. So they have to go now and do alternative paths to be able to figure out and learn all of those skills. We need to figure out how do we get the single mom at Walmart back into the workforce, into a high wage, high growth job, and how we value, right? How that is going to happen, how we're going to train that person. So not only looking, I think K-12, obviously there's a lot more happening that is positive, but also being able to kind of think about the strategy outside of that and how we're transitioning folks in from different parts of the economy.
Yeah, and I will just say, I think that probably the most underappreciated, most transformative, at least one of the most transformative things happening in the United States today is universal school choice. There's 10, 12 states now that have it, probably another 10 that will get it over the next few years. When you think about it just in terms of like long-term shifts, one, I don't think it's very easy to undo a voucher program once you've passed one. It will take some time to build the schools that kind of fit the, say, the $5,000 to $10,000 a year, voucher tuition. Private schools that have that kind of that can meet that tuition. There's a lot of private schools that are much more expensive than that we already have. But when you just think about the number of dollars and how the opportunity to change, introduce competition, really change the incentives on the part of public schools as well, and also just there's a lot of people I think in America, and I think maybe it was reflected in the federal election, who are just abhorred by what's being taught in many public schools, and I think finally giving those people, at least in largely red states, an opportunity to say, no, I want my tax dollars going elsewhere. I think it's probably one of the most significant changes happening in America today, and it's very underappreciated. There's lots of state battles, and teachers unions hate it, and those battles will keep happening. But in terms of something that I think we will look back to 50 years from now, I'm willing to say this is probably one of the top 5, maybe even top three, in just in terms of dollars, how that changes our society. You can homeschool your kids if you want. You can use those funds for homeschooling. You can use them for religious schools. You can use them for, public schools. You can keep them in the public schools if you want. But I think it is such a massive sea change that I think people don't really appreciate.
All right. Yeah.
So one easily addressable thing in our K-12 system, for those students who are in a public school, if they want to pursue a youth apprenticeship, oftentimes the barrier there is that it's hard for a school to count that time doing an apprenticeship and serving with an employer as attendance or seat time. And students end up having to forego getting a high school diploma in order to complete an apprenticeship. So addressing those seat time, high school graduation requirements for youth apprentices is critical. A few states have done that. Colorado's one, but that's something that needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you. We're right at time, but please, if you want to ask additional questions, come talk to our speakers over here, and we appreciate you taking the time. And if you're part of the movement and you're leading work in this space, thank you. Keep going.